Welcome back to the Florida History Podcast. I'm Carter Krishnaiyer.
And I'm Robert Buccellato.
So, Robert, let's wrap up our narrative on the American Revolution and Florida today. And those of you who've been with us for the last, I guess it's been 4 or 5 months now that we've been doing this, although we had a break in the middle, that we've been doing this particular topic. It coincided with Robert and I writing a book that will be out in the United Kingdom in the very near future and in the United States by the end of the year. And so let's go ahead and conclude our story to talk about what happened in the process of the colony being turned back over from the British to the Spanish. And as we talked about last week, British influence never really waned in the colony, even though the British themselves had formally ceded and left the colony. So, in June of 1784, the Spanish governor arrived in St. Augustine to officially take control of East Florida. The governor was appointed by Galvez. Yes, that man again, persistent figure in our story and our narrative for very, very good reason, obviously. Galvez kept the governorship of West Florida for himself. He appointed the governor of East Florida. Now, there was kind of a co-administration for about a year where there was a Spanish and British government simultaneously, which of course was very, very awkward. However, by late August of 1785, British business was basically concluded in East Florida. The last British vessel left St. Augustine in late November of 1785. British soldiers came to supervise the evacuation project and process for the loyalists. There were some people who stayed behind, but for the only about 2,000 people that were in the colony stayed behind, and the Spanish really didn't repopulate the colony. So East Florida again became a backwater. St. Augustine kind of declined as a city. In fact, I think at this point, Robert, we can begin referring to St. Augustine once again as a town or even a village. It wasn't quite a village. Okay, that's an exaggeration, but I think the population of St. Augustine in the second Spanish period was about 2,500. Now, we had said it was upwards of 15,000 at the end of the British period. And in fact, I've seen estimates. So I have to admit, with the numbers I threw out there, 17,000 in the colony, 15,000 in St. Augustine proper in previous episodes, that those are conservative numbers. I've seen numbers as high as 22 to 25,000. 25,000 in the colony of East Florida by 1783 because of all these refugees Florida was absorbing, and then upwards of 20 to 22,000 in St. Augustine, which at that point would have made St. Augustine bigger than Boston, about the same size as New York, not quite as big as Philadelphia, but in the neighborhood. So that's how big St. Augustine had become. And as we talked about in the previous episode, one of the previous episodes in our narrative, that the colony absorbed so many people so quickly, it created all of these logistical hurdles and logistical nightmares. There were people who died in shipwrecks, as we talked about. So even more people were trying to get to East Florida. And basically, if you had taken the, quote, wrong side, so-called wrong side, in the American Revolution in the South, and you had been a loyalist, you tried to flee to East Florida if you weren't going to make peace with the new Patriot rule, with the new United States. And so many people came to Florida that the estimate of 15,000 in St. Augustine might have been low. In any event, you go from 15,000, conservative estimate, down to about 2,500. So you're cutting the population. You're basically keeping under 20% of the population, about 17% of what had been there before. So the market life, the commercial life. I talk a little bit about in our book about the food and drink and the tavern culture in St. Augustine that sprung up 1779, 1780. That all kind of disappears. And it just becomes more or less a military outpost. So before I get your thoughts on this, Robert, let me go through what happened to the loyalist refugees who would come to Florida. Now, we did say about 2,000 of them remain. If we take the 17,000 number, the low end number, if we say 2,000 of them remained, 15,000 of them left the colony. So where did they go? You had lots of refugees go to Jamaica, many to the Bahamas, the biggest chunk to the Bahamas and to Dominica. You had several go to Nova Scotia, some go to, very few go to Quebec, but a few go to Lower Canada, which is what we now call Ontario. But the process was done by early 1786. People had been resettled. Now, what ends up happening also is because you lose your land, Parliament sets up the East Florida Claims Office to compensate a lot of these loyalists for the losses they incurred. That basically, so many of them had given up their property in the Carolinas or Georgia to come to Florida, had claimed property in Florida, and then lost it within 2 years, which is why there was so much controversy about ceding the colony to Spain. And so, about £1 million, which is probably an astronomical sum today. I don't even want to attempt to think what the conversion rate would be, was claimed by refugees who had resettled, but only about £200,000 worth of that, like a fifth of the claims, was actually awarded. Even Governor Tonin, who had relocated to Britain, only got a quarter of what he claimed. So basically, you were given kind of a pro ratio, almost like what stockholders get when a company goes bankrupt and they get 20 cents back on the dollar. So that was the end of official British administration in Florida. But as we talked about, Robert, they kept their hand in the cookie jar until the Americans under Andrew Jackson snapped it off some 35 years later.
Any place that was touched by British hands needed to have those hands snapped off for them to get the picture, I'm afraid.
Yes, and as I wrote about in the book, and let me find the quote, and we will end on this, which will just tell you the status of the Jackson thing. Well, maybe I can't find the quote, but basically Andrew Jackson said something to the extent that, and this was in 1815 or 1816, that basically British influence in Florida has to be eradicated. We will not be safe until they are out of the colony. Now, they're out of Florida. And the irony being, the British had ceded Florida, had formally ceded Florida over 30 years earlier to the Spanish, but clearly the Spanish were incapable of governing the colony, and also, as we talked about, were aligned with Britain and kind of let Britain do their thing in Florida. And basically, this was about the fact that Britain was encouraging slaves to run away, assimilate with the Seminoles. This is where we get the Black Seminoles from, in Florida, and we're arming the Seminoles. There's no two ways about that. We're heavily arming the Seminoles, which is why the Seminole Wars, maybe a topic we'll cover in the future. We covered it a little bit, but maybe more in depth in the future, Robert. We'll leave on this note.
Another series.
Yeah, maybe another series soon. This is a teaser. Robert, I'll let you close on this note. This is why the Seminole Wars became more difficult for the United States than the other wars of Indian removal east of the Mississippi, because the Seminoles had been so heavily armed by the British over the course of about 40 years.
Absolutely.
Okay, before we get out of here, I have found the quote. Jackson's said this directly, and this was in 1813 or 14. Quote, "British influence in Florida must be destroyed, or we will have the whole tribe of Indians to fight, and slave insurrectionists to quell in the southern states. So basically, Jackson was alleging that not only were the British arming the natives, but they were also potentially encouraging slave insurrections. And all of this is true. And they were using Florida as a beachhead, even though, in theory, they ceded the colony and were out of the colony, as we've talked about. In this episode, they were out of the colony by November of 1785. But in 1813 or 1814, Jackson is saying this many, many decades later. So the British are going to reemerge in Florida, but that's for another podcast series, as we talked about. So Robert and I will be back in 2 weeks with a new series, probably 20th century related, here at the Florida History Podcast. And again, want to thank everybody for indulging us in this series on the American Revolution. And our book, being published by Casemate Publishers, will be out in the United Kingdom fairly shortly, very soon, and here in the United States within the next few months. So we will obviously keep everyone notified on that. Thank you for listening to the Florida History Podcast.